So, today we're going to dig into a source text that offers a pretty specific and, let's be honest, often debated perspective on what causes gender dysphoria. The material argues that this experience isn't just one single thing, and it explores several different factors it claims can play a role. Our goal here is simply to unpack the arguments that are being presented in this one source, using these slides to walk through its claims. Okay, so let's get right into it. The source material kicks things off with this really foundational claim you see here. It draws a clear line in the sand, arguing that, yeah, all transgender people have gender dysphoria, but, and this is the key part, not everyone who experiences gender dysphoria is necessarily transgender. This idea is basically the launchpad for its entire argument. So you can see where this is going, right? That premise naturally leads to the big question the source sets out to answer. If it's not always about a core transgender identity, then what else could possibly be at play here? Well, the text lays out several different possibilities, and that's exactly what we're about to break down. Okay, first up, the source dives into what it calls mental health cofactors. Basically, these are other conditions that might be happening at the same time as feelings of dysphoria. The text argues that the symptoms of these conditions can sometimes look a lot like or even get mistaken for gender dysphoria. So let's start with a condition the text describes as especially tricky: borderline personality disorder, or BPD. The source itself calls it the chameleon of mental illness, and that's because it suggests the symptoms can so often look like other things, like depression or anxiety. Now, what's really interesting is how this source zeroes in on these particular symptoms from the DSM-5. It makes the case that a core symptom like having an unstable self-image could easily be misinterpreted. The argument it's making is that this intense feeling of not knowing who you are could show up as distress about your gender, creating an overlap that the source claims is pretty significant. And to really drive this point home, the source brings in testimony from a survey of people who have detransitioned. As you can see from this quote, this person directly connects that struggle with self-identification, which is a hallmark of their BPD, to their decision to transition. Next, the text points to a different kind of overlap it identifies, the one between autism and gender dysphoria, and it highlights this really striking statistic from a 2016 documentary. It claimed that a full 50% of referrals to a major gender clinic in London were for individuals on the autism spectrum. And to illustrate its concern here, the source brings up a very specific story. It talks about an 18-year-old on the autism spectrum who was apparently considered unable to manage her own money, but, the text claims, she was approved for a major surgery after just 2 therapy sessions. The source really uses this story to raise questions about the diagnostic process in certain cases. The source suggests that this feeling of social alienation can be a really key factor. This quote from that same survey is used to perfectly illustrate that point, that feeling of seeing people of your own sex as a completely different species. The text connects that deep sense of otherness to developing gender dysphoria. Then you've got depression and anxiety, which the source also talks about. It paints this potential grass is always greener picture, where someone might pin all their unhappiness on their gender, thinking something like, if I could just change my sex, then everything would be okay. Then I'd be happy. And it's a very similar line of thinking when it comes to body dysmorphic disorder. The source suggests that a general, deep unhappiness with one's body can get mixed up with gender-specific distress. This person from the survey, for example, explains exactly that, how they confuse their body dysmorphia for gender dysphoria. All right, so we've looked at these internal factors. Now, the source kind of shifts gears and looks outward. This second big category it points to involves social and environmental pressures, basically how the world around us might shape our sense of who we are. And it lays out a few different pressures here. It brings up the idea of social contagion in peer groups, the heavy impact of being bullied for not fitting gender norms, the possibility of gaining social status from a trans identity, and even the unspoken wishes a parent might have for a child of a different gender. So, to dig into how bullying can have this really long-term impact, the source brings up this one particular story. It's about a boy who was bullied for being effeminate. He ended up transitioning and living as a woman for 2 decades before eventually realizing that the real issue was just about being okay with having feminine traits as a man. And this all ties back to something we can all relate to, right? That basic human need to belong. In this example from the Detransitioner Survey, the person suggests that their decision to identify as non-binary was, at least in part, driven by a desire to fit in with a certain group at school. Okay, that brings us to the third and final bucket of potential causes the source presents: the impact that trauma can have on someone's identity and their relationship with their own body. Here, the text suggests that a significant trauma can be a really powerful factor. It argues that after something terrible happens, a person might reject their own sex as a kind of defense mechanism, a way to psychologically distance themselves from the event by thinking it would be safer to be the other gender. And again, to connect this abstract idea to a real lived experience, the source brings in some powerful testimony. In this quote, a respondent makes a direct link between their experience of sexual assault and not wanting to be a woman anymore, describing how they developed a masculine self as a way to protect themselves. And the last point the source makes in this section is about internalized homophobia. The argument it presents is that for some people, it might feel socially easier or safer to transition. Why? Because it would allow them to be in a relationship that, to the outside world, looks heterosexual. So where does this leave us? How does the source tie all of these different threads together? Well, it wraps things up by coming back to the perspective that really informs its entire argument, the perspective of detransitioners. Look, the text is upfront about the fact that this is a super debated topic. It acknowledges that many people see these cases as rare exceptions, but in the end, the source sides with the survey data, suggesting that it, along with future research, tells what it calls a far different story. So we've just walked through the specific arguments from one source text on this really complicated topic. It's painted a picture that involves everything from mental health to social pressures to trauma. And it leaves us with this one crucial question that kind of goes beyond all the whys and gets right to the heart of it. How can we best support individuals who are navigating what are clearly very, very complex feelings? That's the question the source leaves us with. Thanks for joining me.